Looking back, there were signs, small, almost insignificant details that I had dismissed at first. Cornelia's sudden increase in late nights at work, her vague explanations, and the way she started holding her phone closer, tilting the screen away whenever I walked by. She'd been talking about new projects and tight deadlines, so I hadn't questioned it. After all, she'd always been ambitious. But the excuses started to pile up. One evening, I decided to surprise her at the office with her favorite coffee. It seemed harmless, a little gesture to show I cared, and I was curious about her workload. When I arrived, her desk was empty. Her co-workers seemed caught off guard when I asked about her. They mentioned she had left hours earlier. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile, pretending I'd simply gotten the timing wrong. The pit in my stomach told me otherwise. When I got home, Cornelia was already there, lounging on the couch like she'd been there for hours. She greeted me warmly, her smile as effortless as ever. She mentioned how exhausting her day had been, talking about meetings and deadlines. I nodded, trying to convince myself that she was telling the truth. But her calmness, her ease, it didn't sit right with me. Something felt wrong. Over the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion. I buried myself in my own work, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. The subtle shifts in her behavior became impossible to ignore. The way she'd suddenly go quiet when her phone buzzed, or the excuses she made when I suggested we spend more time together. A growing part of me feared that the woman I had trusted so completely was hiding something from me. The gap between us grew wider with every passing day. Cornelia was always busy. Too busy for dinner dates, too busy to sit and watch a movie, too busy to have real conversations. She still smiled, still played the part of the loving wife when it suited her, but there was a hollowness behind it, like she was just going through the motions. I began noticing her absences more. She claimed she was attending work events, but when I casually asked her for details, where they were, who attended, her answers felt rehearsed. Once, she mentioned a new colleague who had transferred from another office. Her tone was neutral, detached, but the mention of him stuck in my mind. I didn't even know why. It wasn't just her behavior that was off. She started dressing differently. More effort went into her appearance, even on days when she was supposedly drowning in paperwork. I caught a faint whiff of unfamiliar cologne on her once, a scent that wasn't mine. When I asked about it, she laughed it off, saying it must have come from standing too close to someone at work. At night, when we were in bed, her phone was always within reach, like an extension of her hand. She'd scroll for hours, smiling faintly at whatever she was looking at. Once, I caught a glimpse of a notification that popped up, a message from someone named in. I asked casually, "Who's that?" She barely looked up, claiming it was just a coworker. But something about the way she answered felt too quick, too practiced. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head. After all, we'd been married for years, and Cornelia had never given me a reason to doubt her before. But the unease gnawed at me, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it wouldn't let go. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my growing doubts pressing down on my chest. I didn't want to believe that Cornelia, the woman I loved, was capable of betraying me. But the signs were there, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd uncover the truth. I couldn't stop myself from paying closer attention to everything Cornelia did. It wasn't deliberate at first, more of an instinctual reaction to the growing distance between us. Her behavior, once easy to overlook, now seemed laced with contradictions. She'd claim exhaustion from her demanding job, yet still have the energy to stay out late for after-work gatherings. Her phone became her lifeline, always buzzing, always just out of reach whenever I tried to catch a glance. One evening, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone lying on the kitchen counter. It was an opportunity one hadn't expected, and my heart pounded as I stared at it. I told myself it was wrong, that I should respect her privacy. But the nagging doubts, the endless string of inconsistencies, they were too much to ignore. When I picked it up, I found it locked. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to try her usual passcode. Before I could act, the bathroom door creaked open. I froze, hastily setting the phone back where I'd found it, my hands trembling slightly as I busied myself with the dishes. She walked in a few moments later, towel draped over her shoulders, and flashed me her usual smile. "Thanks for cleaning up," she said, reaching for her phone without even looking at me. I muttered something about it being no problem, but my mind was racing. She seemed unfazed, like she had nothing to hide, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she had caught on to my suspicion. The following weekend, I suggested we spend the day together, hoping to bridge the growing distance. To my surprise, she agreed. We drove out to a local vineyard, a place she'd always loved. For a moment, it felt like old times. Her laughter filled the car, and she reached out to touch my hand as we sipped wine and strolled through the rows of grapevines. But then her phone buzzed. The sound broke the moment like glass shattering. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting for the briefest second before she slipped it back into her purse. "It's just work," she said casually, waving it off. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the moment was gone. The rest of the day felt hollow, her laughter ringing false in my ears. The suspicion that had taken root in my mind was no longer just a whisper. It was growing louder, refusing to be silenced. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I realized that whatever was going on, Cornelia wasn't going to tell me. If I wanted answers, I would have to find them myself. The turning point came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. Cornelia had her usual excuse: work meetings that would run late into the evening. I had grown accustomed to these excuses, but something about the way she said it this time felt off. She avoided eye contact and spoke quickly, almost rehearsed. After she left, I sat in the quiet of our living room, staring at the clock. The unease that had been simmering inside me boiled over. I needed to know the truth. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Where was she really going? Who was she with? On impulse, I grabbed my car keys and drove toward her office. It wasn't far, and if she was really there, I could put these thoughts to rest. But as I approached, my stomach sank. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. I drove around the block, checking for any sign of her, but she was nowhere to be found. I felt a mix of anger and dread as I headed home. Part of me hoped she'd walk through the door and explain everything away with some perfectly reasonable story. But when she returned later that night, she didn't mention anything unusual. Her demeanor was calm, cheerful even, as though nothing were out of the ordinary. As we sat down for dinner, I decided to test her. I casually asked how her meeting had gone. She launched into a story about presentations and deadlines, her voice steady, her smile confident. But I couldn't help noticing the small inconsistencies, details that didn't quite add up, like who was supposedly in the meeting and the timing of it all. I let her talk, nodding along as though I believed every word. But inside, I was fuming. She was lying to my face, and she didn't even flinch. Later that night, while she slept, I sat awake, replaying the evening in my mind. The cracks in her story were becoming impossible to ignore. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I didn't want to fall into. But I couldn't stop myself. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything else. Cornelia had left early for another important meeting, and her cheerful goodbye only made the knot in my stomach tighten. I needed to act to stop letting her lies twist my thoughts into knots. I decided to start with the basics. I remembered the name she had mentioned in passing, Nathan. He was the new guy at work, the one she'd casually dropped into conversations whenever her work stories seemed too vague. I had never met him, never even seen a picture. But something about the way she had brought him up felt deliberate, like she was planting a harmless story to cover her tracks. I pulled up her work's website and scrolled through the employee directory. It didn't take long to find him. Nathan Holloway. His photo showed a man in his mid-30s, dressed sharply, with a confident smirk that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to start connecting dots. The next step required more courage than I thought I had. That evening, when Cornelia was showering, I picked up her phone again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I tried her usual passcode, and my heart skipped a beat when the screen unlocked. Her messages were neatly organized, but I didn't have to dig far. Nathan's name sat near the top of her recent conversations. My hands trembled as I opened the thread. At first, it seemed innocent enough, work-related topics, casual banter. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. The messages became more personal, more intimate. He complimented her appearance, and she responded with laughing emojis and playful remarks. My chest tightened as I kept reading, the words feeling like daggers. Then I saw it. A message from him, sent just a few days earlier. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." Her reply was there too. "Me too. Can't wait for the next time. I'll make up another excuse soon." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, hoping I was reading it wrong, that there was some other explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. This was it, the truth I had been dreading. I locked her phone and put it back where I found it just as the shower turned off. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to appear calm. When she came out of the bathroom, She smiled at me as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I knew now what I had only suspected before. Cornelia wasn't just lying to me. She was betraying me, and she didn't even try to hide it. As I lay in bed that night, I made a silent vow. If she thought she could play me for a fool, she was wrong. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not anymore. The next morning, Cornelia left the house as usual, her routine unchanged. She kissed me goodbye, smiling brightly, and mentioned she'd be home late again. Her lies rolled off her tongue so easily now it made my skin crawl. I watched her leave, the door closing behind her with a soft click, and then sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee. I had spent the entire night thinking about my next move. The messages I had read were seared into my mind, their words playing over and over like a broken record. Anger bubbled under the surface, but I knew I couldn't act impulsively. If I wanted to confront her, I needed more than just my suspicions and a few texts. I decided to follow her. It felt drastic, even ridiculous, but I had to know where she went when she wasn't working late. I waited an hour after she left before grabbing my keys and heading out. My hands were clammy as I started the car, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me. Driving to her office was easy enough. I knew the route by heart. But instead of parking, I found a spot across the street where I could watch from a distance. I didn't have to wait long. Cornelia's car pulled out of the lot less than 30 minutes after I arrived. I slouched down in my seat, my heart pounding as I watched her drive past. She wasn't heading home, and she wasn't going to another office building. My pulse quickened as I started my car and followed at a safe distance. Her route was unfamiliar, winding through streets I rarely traveled. After about 15 minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of a cozy-looking cafe tucked away in a quieter part of town. I parked a block away and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. From my spot, I saw her step out of her car. She wasn't dressed like someone going to work. Her outfit was casual, but put together in a way that screamed date rather than business meeting. She checked her phone briefly before walking toward the entrance. Then, Nathan appeared. He was already seated at an outdoor table, leaning back with an easy confidence that made my blood boil. Cornelia walked up to him, and they greeted each other with a hug that lingered far too long. I sat frozen in my car, watching the scene unfold like something out of a nightmare. They laughed, leaned toward each other, completely at ease. My stomach churned, the reality of their betrayal playing out in front of me like a cruel movie I couldn't escape. I stayed there for nearly an hour, watching as they sipped their coffee and chatted, their body language betraying an intimacy that left no doubt about what was going on. When they finally stood to leave, Nathan placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her toward her car. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. My hands trembled as I started the car and drove home, my mind racing. I now had proof, more than enough to confront her. But as I pulled into the driveway, a new thought struck me. Confronting her would be satisfying, yes, but it wouldn't be enough. Not for what she had done. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too. But I'd make sure the outcome was on my terms. By the time I walked into the house, my resolve had hardened. Watching Cornelia and Nathan together had lit a fire in me. One that wasn't just fueled by anger, but by the need for control. If she wanted to deceive me, I would use her own lies against her. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to dismantle the perfect little facade she had built. The first thing I did was gather my thoughts. I couldn't let emotion cloud my judgment. I needed a plan. I started by jotting down everything I already knew. The late-night meetings, the messages on her phone, the cafe rendezvous. It wasn't much, but it was enough to piece together a picture of her betrayal. Over the next few days, I began documenting everything. Every excuse she gave, every time she came home late, every vague story that didn't quite add up, I wrote it all down. I even started keeping track of her location using a phone app. It felt invasive, but then again, so was her infidelity. Cornelia, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing was amiss. She still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still smiled when she talked about her busy days. But I noticed the cracks in her performance. She was becoming careless, mentioning details that contradicted her earlier stories, texting Nathan right in front of me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, she came home later than usual, her makeup slightly smudged and her hair disheveled. She blamed it on a long meeting, claiming she had worked through dinner. I simply nodded, not letting my expression betray what I knew. Inside, I was boiling. That night, after she fell asleep, I opened her laptop. She had always been lax about security, and sure enough, her email account was still logged in. What I found there confirmed everything I had suspected. And more. There were emails between her and Nathan. Their tone playful and flirtatious at first, but growing more intimate as the weeks went on. They talked about secret getaways, about how thrilling it was to keep the game going. One message from her stood out. He doesn't suspect a thing. He's too busy with his art to even notice. My chest tightened as I read the words. She thought I was oblivious, too consumed with my own world to see what was happening right in front of me. The irony was almost laughable. But there was something else. Nestled among the emails was a confirmation for a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. It was booked under Nathan's name, but the recipient was Cornelia. The dates were only 2 weeks away. I stared at the screen, the wheels in my mind turning. This wasn't just an opportunity to catch her in the act. It was a chance to show her exactly who she was dealing with. I logged out of her email and closed the laptop, a plan already beginning to take shape. Cornelia had underestimated me. That was her first mistake, and it would be her last. The knowledge of their planned weekend trip gave me the edge I needed. If Cornelia thought she could sneak away without consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. My plan was simple, but required precision. I needed to time everything perfectly to ensure she wouldn't see it coming. Over the next week, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I stayed warm, attentive even, giving her no reason to suspect anything had changed. She, on the other hand, became increasingly distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. I noticed her packing small items into a bag she kept hidden in the closet. Clothes, toiletries, even a lacy dress I'd never seen her wear. She thought she was being clever, but every move she made only fueled my determination. Meanwhile, I did my own research. The cabin Nathan had booked wasn't far, about an hour's drive from the city. It was a secluded spot, surrounded by thick woods and overlooking a serene lake. Perfect for a romantic getaway. Perfect for a confrontation. But I wasn't just going to show up and call her out. That would be too easy, too predictable. No, I wanted something bigger. Something that would make her lies unravel in front of her. I reached out to a private investigator, someone discreet who could gather hard evidence. If Cornelia was going to play games, I'd make sure the rules were stacked against her. The investigator, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Claire, wasted no time. Within days, she provided me with surveillance photos of Cornelia and Nathan together. At the cafe, at his car, even entering a hotel. Each image was a dagger to the heart, but they were exactly what I needed. Concrete proof of her betrayal. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I needed to ensure that Cornelia left for her trip thinking everything was normal. I didn't want her suspecting that I was onto her, so I kept my routine unchanged. I worked in my studio during the day, acted affectionate in the evenings, and didn't so much as glance at her phone again. The night before the trip, she was unusually upbeat. She talked about a work retreat she had to attend, apologizing for being gone over the weekend. I nodded along, keeping my expression neutral, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. When she went to bed, I stayed up late, finalizing the details of my plan. By the time I closed my laptop, everything was in place. The cabin wasn't just going to be their hideaway. It was going to be the stage where her lies came crashing down. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Cornelia slept soundly beside me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were set. All I had to do now was wait. The morning of Cornelia's trip, she was unusually cheerful, almost giddy. She packed her bag carefully, sneaking it out to the car while I pretended to be engrossed in a sketch in my studio. She called out a bright goodbye, mentioning again how demanding the work retreat would be. I watched her drive away from the window, the same forced smile plastered on my face until she was out of sight. The moment her car disappeared, I sprang into action. My own bag was already packed, basic essentials, my camera, and the documents from Claire, the private investigator. Everything I needed to confront her was ready. I gave her a good head start before getting into my car and heading in the same direction. The drive to the cabin felt surreal. My emotions were all over the place. Anger, sadness, even a strange sense of exhilaration. This was it, the moment I'd finally faced the truth head-on. As I got closer to the cabin, the landscape changed, becoming quieter and more remote. The thick woods loomed on either side of the winding road, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a beautiful place, the kind you'd want to share with someone you loved. The thought of Cornelia being here with Nathan twisted the knife in my chest a little deeper. I parked my car a short distance from the cabin, hidden from view, but close enough to see the gravel driveway. Cornelia's car was already there, parked beside Nathan's sleek sedan. My jaw tightened at the sight of them together, standing on the porch. Cornelia was laughing, her head tilted back in that carefree way she used to reserve for me. Nathan leaned close, his hand resting on her waist. I grabbed my camera and snapped a few photos. Not because I needed more evidence. I already had enough, but because I wanted a record of this moment. A reminder of how little regard she had for the life we'd built together. I stayed out of sight as they went inside, watching the door close behind them. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't rush in there and confront them now. That wasn't the plan. Instead, I waited, giving them time to settle. The cabin was small, with wide windows that let in natural light. From my vantage point, I could see into the living room. They were sitting on the couch, their bodies close, her hand resting on his knee. I gritted my teeth and focused on the plan. This wasn't just about catching them. It was about making Cornelia face the consequences of her actions. She thought she could hide here, that her lies would stay neatly tucked away. But she was wrong. The stage was set, and soon, the curtain would rise. I waited patiently outside the cabin, watching the scene unfold through the large windows. Cornelia and Nathan were laughing, relaxed, their guards completely down. Seeing her like this, so comfortable, so happy, was infuriating. She had been lying to me with such ease, yet here she was acting as if she had nothing to hide. When the moment felt right, I made my move. I approached the cabin quietly, making sure my steps didn't crunch on the gravel. My pulse was racing, but my mind was clear. I knocked on the door firmly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. Inside, I heard muffled voices. A pause. Then footsteps. The door opened slightly, and there was Cornelia, her face frozen in shock. Her eyes widened as she registered who was standing in front of her, and for a split second, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Liam," she stammered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I pushed the door open further and stepped inside. Nathan was standing behind her, his face a mixture of confusion and unease. He glanced at Cornelia, clearly trying to gauge what was going on. The tension in the room was palpable. Cornelia quickly composed herself, her tone shifting to something colder. "You shouldn't be here," she said, trying to sound authoritative, but her voice trembled slightly. "This is a private retreat." "A retreat?" I said, my voice calm but sharp. "That's an interesting choice of words." Nathan took a step forward, clearly trying to play the peacemaker. "Look, man, I don't know what's going on here, but maybe we should talk." I cut him off with a glare that made him stop mid-sentence. "You don't get to speak," I said, my tone low and firm. Cornelia's facade began to crack. "Liam, this isn't what it looks like," she started, her voice dripping with forced sincerity. "I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. "That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That all those late nights and work meetings were just excuses to be with him?" I pointed at Nathan, who was now shifting uncomfortably. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I pulled out the folder I had brought with me, the photos, the emails, the surveillance reports. I tossed it onto the coffee table between us, the papers spilling out for them both to see. "I know everything, Cornelia," I said, my voice cold. "Every lie, every excuse, every moment you thought you could get away with this." Cornelia's face went pale as she looked down at the damning evidence. Nathan stayed silent, his jaw tightening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" I continued, my words cutting through the tense silence. "You thought you could keep me in the dark while you played house with him?" Cornelia's lips parted, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless. The confident, composed woman I had watched from the outside just moments ago was gone, replaced by someone scrambling to regain control. "Liam, I can explain," she finally said, her voice shaky. "This isn't—" "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear another lie." The room was silent again, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy in the air. Cornelia and Nathan stood frozen, their perfect little escape crumbling around them. But this was only the beginning. Cornelia's face twisted into a mix of defiance and panic. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her voice sharp now, as though she could regain control by sheer force of will. This isn't some big conspiracy, Liam. It's not what you think." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "It's not what I think." I gestured to the papers scattered across the coffee table, the photos, the emails. "That's a lot of not what I think for something so harmless, don't you think?" Nathan tried to step in again, clearing his throat. "Look, man, I didn't mean to." "Shut up," I said, not even looking at him. My focus was solely on Cornelia. You had every opportunity to come clean, every chance to tell me the truth. But instead, you chose to lie, over and over again. And now this? I waved my hand around the cabin. A cozy little getaway with your boyfriend? Cornelia crossed her arms, her expression hardening. I wasn't happy, Liam, she said, as if that justified everything. You were always so focused on your work, so wrapped up in your art. You barely even notice me anymore. Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I shot back, my voice rising. I wasn't the one sneaking around. I wasn't the one lying to my spouse every chance I got. Don't pretend this is about anything other than your selfish choices. She flinched at that, but I could see her scrambling for a defense, anything that would shift the blame. You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible, she said, her tone desperate now. Nathan, he made me feel seen. My jaw tightened, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. You felt invisible? You mean while I was working to build a life for us? While I trusted you completely, thinking we were a team? Don't talk to me about feeling invisible, Cornelia. You don't get to play the victim here. Nathan, apparently unable to keep quiet any longer, stepped forward again. Look, man, maybe this is something you two need to work out privately. I don't want to cause more drama. I turned to him, my eyes narrowing. Privately? You think you get to waltz out of here like none of this is your problem? You're just as guilty as she is. You knew she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing. Nathan raised his hands defensively, taking a step back. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I laughed again, bitter and sharp. Didn't mean for it to get this far? What did you think was going to happen, Nathan? Did you think I'd just shrug and say, oh well, good luck with my wife? Is that how you thought this would end? Cornelia's composure was slipping. Liam, please, let's just talk about this. Just the two of us. We can fix this. Fix this? I repeated, my voice cold. There's no fixing this, Cornelia. You destroyed everything the moment you decided to lie to me. You think I can just forget what I've seen? What I've heard? Her expression crumbled, but I felt no pity. For the first time, I could see the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. She had thought she could control this, keep her lies contained. But now, everything was laid bare, and there was no escape. And I wasn't done yet. Cornelia's mask of composure cracked further, her face pale and strained as she tried to find words that would somehow undo the damage. Liam, we've been together for years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Can't we at least try to fix this? Her voice carried a desperate edge now, but I didn't flinch. Years, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Years that I thought were built on trust, on partnership. But you, I pointed at her, my voice growing colder. You turned those years into a lie the moment you brought him into this. I gestured toward Nathan, who looked increasingly uncomfortable, his confidence evaporating as the confrontation wore on. Cornelia shot him a glance, but he avoided her eyes, clearly unprepared for the fallout of their little escapade. I didn't mean to hurt you, Cornelia said, her voice trembling. Things got complicated, and I didn't know how to. Don't, I interrupted sharply, holding up a hand. Don't you dare try to justify this as some sort of accident. Cheating isn't complicated, Cornelia. It's a choice. Every lie, every message, every moment you spent with him instead of being honest with me. That was your choice. She opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again, her words dying on her lips. Nathan, meanwhile, looked as though he wished he could disappear. I stepped closer to him, my gaze fixed on his increasingly nervous expression. And you, I said, my voice steady but filled with contempt. You thought you could just walk into someone else's life and take what wasn't yours. Did you even think about the damage you were causing? Or did you just tell yourself it didn't matter because she was unhappy? Nathan cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to defend himself. It's not like that. I didn't plan for this to happen. We just connected. Connected? I snapped, my anger flaring again. Is that what you call it? You connected, so it made destroying a marriage acceptable? Spare me the excuses. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if weighing whether he could make a clean getaway. I could feel the tension rising in the room, thick and suffocating. Cornelia stepped between us, her voice rising. Stop it, Liam. This isn't going to solve anything. You can yell all you want, but it's not going to change what's happened. You're right, I said, my voice soft but cutting. It won't change what's happened, but it will make sure you both understand the consequences of your choices. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of evidence Claire had gathered, the photos, the emails, the receipts. I placed them on the coffee table with deliberate precision, letting the weight of the proof speak for itself. Cornelia stared at the pile, her hands trembling as she realized how thoroughly her lies had been exposed. Nathan paled, his confident demeanor completely gone. "This isn't just about me," I said, my voice steady now. "It's about accountability. You both made choices, and now you have to live with them." I let the silence stretch, watching as they absorbed the reality of what I had laid before them. The illusion they had crafted so carefully was shattered, and there was no putting it back together. But I wasn't finished yet. Cornelia's breathing grew shallow as she stared at the evidence on the table. Her hands clenched and unclenched as though she were trying to decide whether to defend herself or admit defeat. Nathan, meanwhile, stood frozen, his gaze darting between me and the door like a cornered animal. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the back of a chair, my voice low but deliberate. "You thought this would stay hidden, didn't you? A little secret between the two of you, while I played the fool. But here's the thing about secrets. They always have a way of coming out." Cornelia finally spoke, her voice wavering. "What do you want from me, Liam? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I messed up. I made mistakes. But do you really have to humiliate me like this?" "Humiliate you?" I asked, the incredulity in my tone unmistakable. "You lied to me. You betrayed me. You didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. And now you're worried about your humiliation." I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. "No, Cornelia. This isn't about humiliating you. This is about showing you what happens when you treat someone's trust like it's disposable." Nathan finally found his voice, though it wavered with every word. "Look, man, I get it. You're upset. But maybe it's better if I just leave, and you two work this out." I turned to him, my gaze piercing. "You don't get to walk away from this, Nathan. You're just as responsible as she is. You knew she was married, and you didn't care. You thought you could have your little fling and move on without consequence. But you were wrong." He swallowed hard, his bravado completely stripped away. I turned back to Cornelia, my voice soft but heavy with meaning. "I loved you. I trusted you. And you threw that away for this?" I gestured toward Nathan, who flinched slightly. "Was it worth it, Cornelia? All the lies, the sneaking around. Did it make you happy?" She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy, until I finally straightened and reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table. "What's that?" Cornelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Divorce papers," I said simply. "I had them drawn up last week. You've made your choices, Cornelia, and now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, the vulnerability, the regret. But it wasn't enough. It was too little too late. Nathan shifted awkwardly, clearly desperate to escape the fallout. I turned to him one last time. "I hope she was worth it, Nathan, because now you get to deal with the mess you helped create." I grabbed my bag and turned to leave, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Cornelia called my name, her voice breaking, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. As I walked out of the cabin, the crisp air filled my lungs, and for the first time in weeks, I felt free. The weight of her lies, her betrayal, it was still there, but now it wasn't mine to carry. This was the end of us, but it was also the beginning of something new. A life without her deception. A life where I could finally move forward. The drive home was quiet, the woods passing by in a blur. My mind felt oddly calm, as though the storm that had raged inside me for weeks had finally run its course. The confrontation had drained me, but it had also brought a strange sense of closure. I had faced the truth, laid it all bare, and now I could begin to pick up the pieces of my life without her lies weighing me down. When I got home, the house felt different. It wasn't the warm, inviting place I had once shared with Cornelia. Now it was just a building filled with memories, some good, many of them tainted. I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd have to pack up and leave, start fresh somewhere else. But for now, I needed to sit with the silence and let it remind me of what I had lost and what I was letting go of. Over the next few days, I heard nothing from Cornelia. No calls, no texts, no attempts to explain or apologize further. It was as if she had finally accepted the inevitability of what was happening. Part of me had expected her to try to fight for us, to beg for forgiveness. But the part of me that had seen her with Nathan knew better. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she had been caught. The divorce process was surprisingly smooth. Cornelia signed the papers without much resistance, her once fiery demeanor replaced by quiet resignation. I assumed she was too embarrassed or ashamed to put up a fight, especially after being exposed so thoroughly. Either that or Nathan was now her focus, and she didn't want to linger on the wreckage of our marriage any longer than necessary. I focused on my work during this time, pouring my emotions into my art the way I always had. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it all found its way into my sculptures. My studio became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, the place where I wrestled with my feelings and slowly began to rebuild myself. Every piece I created felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming my identity and purpose. Word about the confrontation at the cabin began to spread, thanks to mutual friends who had pieced together the story. I didn't care about the gossip. It didn't change what had happened, and I wasn't interested in defending myself to anyone. If anything, I hoped it served as a cautionary tale for others. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it's nearly impossible to repair. Despite everything, there were moments of doubt, of grief. I had loved Cornelia deeply, and losing her, even under these circumstances, felt like losing a part of myself. But I reminded myself that love isn't supposed to feel like betrayal, like constantly questioning your worth. What we'd had was gone, and it wasn't coming back. I heard through the grapevine that things between Cornelia and Nathan weren't going as smoothly as she'd hoped. Their relationship, built on lies and deceit, was starting to show cracks. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt relief. It wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. As for me, I focused on moving forward. My art began to garner attention in ways it never had before, and I found myself reconnecting with parts of myself I had forgotten in the chaos of our marriage. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Months passed, and the sting of betrayal began to dull. Time didn't erase the memories, but it gave me the space to view them differently, not as scars, but as lessons. I learned how to trust myself again, how to live a life that wasn't defined by someone else's choices. The house that Cornelia and I had shared became a relic of the past, a place I no longer recognized as home. I sold it without hesitation, using the proceeds to move to a small loft closer to my studio. The space was simple but perfect for me, a blank canvas to rebuild my life. Work became my anchor. The sculptures I created during those months carried the rawness of my emotions, each piece telling a story of betrayal, resilience, and rediscovery. One piece in particular, The Broken Vow, garnered widespread acclaim. It was a haunting sculpture of intertwined hands, one gripping tightly while the other slipped away, leaving fractures behind. The art world took notice, and soon my work was being showcased in galleries I'd only dreamed of. Critics praised the emotional depth of my pieces, but for me, the process was deeply personal. Each sculpture was a step forward, a way of reclaiming the parts of myself that Cornelia's betrayal had tried to break. One evening, at the opening of a new exhibition, I found myself standing before The Broken Vow, watching as visitors admired the piece. A woman approached me, her eyes lingering on the sculpture before meeting mine. "It's powerful," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "It feels honest." I smiled, nodding. "It is." It came from a very real place. We talked for a while, her presence a refreshing change from the chaos of the past. Her name was Elena, an art historian with a passion for storytelling. There was no rush, no expectations, just two people connecting over shared interests. It was the kind of conversation that reminded me of what it felt like to trust someone again. As the night went on, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Cornelia and Nathan were nothing more than distant memories now, their impact on my life fading like shadows in the light of a new day. The pain they caused had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I had taken what they tried to destroy and turned it into something stronger. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by the fruits of my labor and the promise of new beginnings, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Life had thrown its punches, but I had endured. And in that moment, I knew I was ready for whatever came next.